What's going on, guys? This is another Tower Number 9 Star Wars Unlimited video. This time we have another Double Aggro Sabine game. This time I'm going to be playing against, or rather, a set of games. I think we got more than one here, and we're going to be playing against a Tarkin aggro deck. Grand Moff Tarkin running Tarkin Town there. So we are going to roll off to see who goes first, and I'm going to lead off the game by rolling a 1. So it will be my opponent's initiative, and we'll see how this goes. Double red Sabine, double aggro Sabine versus Tarkin aggression. So this is not a very good opening hand. I do have a turn one play, but it's the Cantina Braggart, which I don't consider a very good card necessarily. Can do some damage for sure, but not what I most want to start with. However, I'm looking into something worse than that. I have no turn one play. I have 3 wing leaders and nothing to buff with them, and my turn two is actually not great either. Although I may be able to get some value with the Star Wing Scout. So we'll see how this goes. Going to be a bit of a slower start for me, I think, but hopefully I'll be able to turn it around. So yeah, gonna be a tough start. You definitely do want to have a turn one play, especially with a deck this aggressive, especially against a deck that often has a stronger late game like Tarkin. But we're gonna start things off maybe at a bit of a disadvantage and see where we go from there. So my opponent's gonna lead off by playing a Admiral Ozzel. And I believe I just take the initiative here. I'd rather do that than use Sabine's ability, especially because the Starwing Scout is advantaged by having initiative. However, I do end up drawing a card that's maybe going to be better for me than the Starwing Scout, the Fighters for Freedom, and we'll see how this goes. The Starving Scout is a reasonable play here for sure. The Fighters for Freedom also somewhat reasonable. Tarkin's ability, though, on his leader side can give experience to his units and might be able to get the Ozzel there out of range of the Fighters for Freedom if that's where he ends up going with it. However, I can potentially counter next turn by playing a Wing Leader. However, I do end up going with the Stormwing Scout. 3 cost 4/1 when defeated. If you have the initiative, draw 2 cards. So if my opponent does have some answer to this unit in this turn, it will be favorable for me. Also, if he uses Ozzel's ability to bring a unit in readied, the Stormwing Scout will ready up and be able to attack his base for 4. So he ends up playing a Snow Trooper Lieutenant and having Ozzel attack the base at +1 strength. So 4 damage to me there. And I use Sabine's ability, but then I'm like, wait a minute, actually, hang on. And I point out that Snow Trooper Lieutenant shouldn't be readied, which means that I think I actually might not want to use Sabine's ability here, um, because the opponent is made more likely to just take the initiative. But he still has a floating resource, and with that floating resource is likely going to give an experience counter, but actually doesn't do it. So ends up taking the initiative, which is interesting. It's possible that I should have taken the initiative instead of using Sabine's ability, as that would have meant the Starwing Scout ability would still be live for this turn in case he has some removal for it. But I thought it was quite likely my opponent would be giving out an experience with Tarkin. However, in this case, I think he wisely took the initiative instead because he has an Imperial Interceptor to kill the Starwing Scout, and that's huge value for my opponent. When played, you may deal 3 damage to a space unit. Not only does he clear the Scout without it getting the main benefit of its ability, but also he has he's managed to get a substantial presence in both arenas here, and I am going to be able to deploy Sabine this turn. I have General Dodonna, and it is going to be a buff there, but the Imperial Interceptor is already a really efficient unit against enemy space units. One of the most efficient space counters in the game, at least for the small units. So having that plus the initiative to negate the benefit of the Starwing Scout, really good for my opponent. Sends the Snow Trooper Lieutenant to attack my base. I deploy Sabine. Um, Incidentally, I do think it was actually a bit of an error not to use Ozzel's ability here because he could have used Ozzel's ability to bring that Interceptor in readied, And if he had brought the interceptor in readied, then he would have been able to deal 3 damage to my base by attacking with the interceptor instead of the 2 with Ozzel. And because he was removing my Starwing Scout with the ability, I wouldn't have had to use it to ready myself. So a bit of a consideration there. I do currently have a stronger board than my opponent with General Dodonna there, plus my Sabine. But the thing is, Sabine is my leader, so I've brought my leader out earlier than my opponent here. And that is going to be, he's going to have his Tarkin deploy in this turn. So the benefit that you can get from an earlier leader deploy is maybe somewhat temporary, in that in the opponent is going to have a chance to bring out their own leader later on and maybe even things up a bit. Here we see Overwhelming Barrage, one of the best cards in the game, being used on the Interceptor. Um, and that is going to give him 5 damage, which isn't enough to kill both of my units here. So it could be worse. But 5 damage is still going to be enough to. He could defeat Sabine with 4 damage and then put one on Dodonna. And then he could potentially buff his he could remove Dodonna with Tarkin Town or buff his Snow Trooper Lieutenant with an experience and then remove Dodonna. I end up having Dodonna attack and defeat the Snow Trooper Lieutenant so that my opponent won't have a chance to give it experience or use Tarkin Town. He couldn't have given it experience this turn with his leader ability, but he could deploy Tarkin, attack my base, and give the lieutenant experience that way. I then deploy the Fighters for Freedom here. 3/4 Saboteur. When you play another aggression card, you may deal 1 damage to a base. Might have been better to play aggression to remove the interceptor there. Might have been better. And I take the initiative. My opponent attacks. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if he attacks Dodonna or if he attacks the base. He attacks Dodonna, taking 4 damage and but giving an experience token to that interceptor. So now I do have one advantage, which is that my with the initiative this turn, my Fighters for Freedom can just attack and defeat Tarkin immediately, which is pretty good. I also have the ability to use a copy of I can use a copy of Aggression to defeat the Interceptor this turn as well. So I have some options available. So yeah, there's the Fighters for Freedom defeat Tarkin immediately. He still has the experienced Interceptor on the board, but I can potentially play Aggression to defeat the Interceptor and ready up the Fighters for Freedom, which would be some solid value. It would also deal 1 damage to my opponent's base. My opponent brings out a Super Laser Technician, which doesn't seem like the strongest thing possible. It's a little late for that in some ways, but you know, we'll see what happens. I'm indeed gonna use Aggression. I choose to deal 4 damage to the Interceptor, which will clear it, and I'm gonna ready a unit with 3 or less power. That's the Fighters for Freedom. Also, I can deal 1 damage to his base by playing a red card with the Fighters for Freedom in play. So I now have some extra damage coming through that way, or I could just use the Fighters for Freedom to clear the Super Laser Technician. My opponent ends up deciding to Tarkin Town the Fighters for Freedom and clear them before they can attack again. I deploy a Green Squadron A-Wing, and my opponent plays an Emperor's Royal Guard. I take the initiative. So I'm not very happy with this position. My opponent has the advantage on board and in life totals. I do have some plays that I can make for sure, but I don't feel my position's very strong. So this turn, I could, for instance, I would really like to see Mace Windu here, but he has not deigned to show up for me. Or if he has, it was earlier in the game and I resourced him. I can play. So one thing that I could do here is I could Fleet Lieutenant the A-Wing in for 5 damage, and then follow up with an aggression to defeat one of my opponent's units, probably the Royal Guard, and stand up the A-Wing to make another attack. Royal Guard hits my base for 3. I can aggression to kill. I deploy another A-wing. Um, Arguably, it would have been better for me to lead off with aggression, but didn't happen. My opponent has another interceptor, unfortunately for me, clearing the A-wing and leaving him with a unit on board. The Imperial Interceptor is very, very efficient against these smaller fighters, as it is very easy to get a 2-for-1 with it. Um, I think I end up playing aggression anyway to defeat the. I think I end up playing aggression anyway to defeat the Royal Guard and maybe ready my A-wing. No, I draw a card. I take the initiative. I think it might have been better for me to ready the A-wing and then trade it with the interceptor here, because I'm probably going to have to trade the A-wing with the interceptor anyway, and doing it doing it a turn early would allow me to spend my actions more efficiently. Again, hoping to draw Mace Windu and again not seeing him. So one thing that I could do here is I could Fleet Lieutenant to develop my board while also doing that, but I end up just doing the straight attack instead, which I actually think is an error because I'm now in a position where the Fleet Lieutenant would be, if I play out the Fleet Lieutenant, I lose some tempo and I don't get his ability. Doesn't seem so good. My opponent attacks in for 2 damage with the Super Laser Technician. I play Dodonna, but the situation's not looking good, and my opponent makes it worse by bringing out an ATST. I have to take the initiative here. I can't play anything else. So this is also an example of why playing that Fleet Lieutenant on the A-Wing would have been a lot better. If I had played the Fleet Lieutenant on the A-Wing, I would have another unit on the board. I do have a surprise strike in hand. I can surprise strike Dodonna into the ATST to trade, which is not terrible. But imagine if I had been surprise striking the Fleet Lieutenant in, buffed by Dodonna to make that trade, and I still had Dodonna on the board. Dodonna could then potentially attack and remove this Super Laser Technician. That would have been a much better situation for me that I'm not sure it would have mattered. My opponent plays a tie advanced, buffing the Super Laser Technician, +2 strength. That actually does mean that he has lethal, but I plan open fire and kill the Technician without it getting a chance to do anything this turn. Does become a resource, a ready resource though, which is the upside of that card. So Super Laser Technician, very cool card. 3 cost 2/1, which is very inefficient stat wise, but when defeated, it becomes a readied resource, making it a premier ramp card. Maybe the best ramp card in the game right now, though I'm not 100% sure. My opponent then plays Tarkin, which will allow him to draw 2 cards. Search his top 5 for up to 2 Imperial cards and draw 2. I take the initiative. Or search the top 5 cards for up to 2 Imperial cards and then draw them. I take the initiative here, and my opponent, looking at what to pick, ends up picking a another interceptor, which I don't like seeing for the space arena. But the second card here is a Snowtrooper Lieutenant, and that's game. I don't have anything that can kill 2 units at once, so regardless of, like, maybe I draw some removal and I can kill one of these units, but then the Snowtrooper Lieutenant gets played to buff the other one and come in and destroy the base. So that is game. I think that I may have made some errors there. I think not playing the Fleet Lieutenant to send the A-Wing in meant that my endgame board was substantially weaker than it could have been. I also think that I suffered from the earlier turn where I used Sabine's ability, assuming that my opponent was going to use Tarkin's ability, but he ended up just taking the initiative and letting the Interceptor kill the Starwing Scout to get huge value. It would have been better for me not to use Sabine's ability at that point. And then, lastly, I do think that simply not having a turn 1 play cost me a lot. So, but we're going to go into game 2. So I'm 0-1, and let's see if I can do better in the next round. So Sabine Wren, the unit, Sabine Wren Explosives Artist, one of the best 2 drops in the game. 2/3 on attack may deal 1 damage to the target or to a base. I take the initiative after my opponent plays Ozzel. This is going to be pretty favorable for me because I can just have Sabine clear out Ozzel immediately. And this is one of the big advantages of Sabine Wren Explosives Artist is that she can just attack into enemy units and clear them. Yep. So Sabine attacks Ozzel, 1 damage from the on attack, 2 damage from stats. Ozzel removed immediately before my opponent can play anything that might buff him, give him an experience with Tarkin, anything like that. Nope, just removed. Happy to see that. My opponent spends 2 for a Snow Trooper Lieutenant now who can't do anything. And this is a good example of why having the initiative can be so important in these situations. If my opponent had had the initiative, he could have used the Snow Trooper Lieutenant to have Oslo actually defeat Sabine and stay on the board. I deploy the Fighters for Freedom, and my opponent then is going to take the initiative. So the Snow Trooper Lieutenant on the board can trade with Sabine, which is, it's fine. It does mean that Sabine gets a 2 for 1, which is pretty good. Um, but we will see. I can also have, if I have the initiative, my Sabine can either attack the enemy base for 3 or could attack to clear the Snow Trooper Lieutenant and deal 1 damage. My opponent could, of course, give the Snow Trooper Lieutenant experience using Tarkin's ability, but Sabine could still attack into it and use her on attack ability on him instead of the base to defeat to trade even with that buff. And the Fighters for Freedom as a 3/4 could just trade defeat the Snow Trooper Lieutenant directly without even trading. So he indeed ends up using his first action to have the Snow Trooper Lieutenant trade with Sabine. I have the Fighters for Freedom just hit the enemy base for 3 damage. I do have a copy of Aggression in hand, and I have a copy of General Dodonna. So conceivably, I could play the Aggression to kill a unit and ready the Fighters for Freedom. He ends up playing a Starwing Scout, though, which I don't really want to kill because it will give him 2 cards. So I end up playing General Dodonna instead to develop my ground arena more, which I actually think this might be a mistake. I think it might be better for me to kill the Starwing Scout. And the reason I say this is because my opponent's deck does have overwhelming barrage, and he can now barrage me for 6. But that's a barrage for 6 would still only kill 1 unit, so it could be worse. But I do think it's reasonable to think about clearing or wanting to put a higher priority on clearing the board, especially clearing high value units if you are playing against an opponent who has over access to overwhelming barrage. Um, just something to consider. On the plus side, my ground arena is very strong with Sabine, the Fighters for Freedom, and General Dodonna. Now, my opponent tries to play command, but I point out that it's out of aspect for him since he only has one green command aspect icon, not two. So he, in fact, can't play it because it would cost 6. And then he's thinking about what to do now, and he ends up playing a tie advanced, but I point out that the experience tokens don't work on the Starwing Scout because it's not an Imperial unit. So kind of an unfortunate situation with both of his top plays not really working out the way that he maybe hoped. But he does have an alternative play, ends up playing another Starwing Scout for even more aggression in the space arena. So I, however, have a lot of damage on the ground arena. So I can attack with Sabine here. So I attack with Sabine for 4 total damage, 2 base, +1 power from Dodonna, 1 damage to base from her ability. My opponent still has a readied Starwing Scout. Can attack in for 4 damage to my base here, and does. I end up playing. I decide that I am going to. I think I decide here that I am going to play aggression for more damage to the base this turn, which can actually get me the win. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just push damage through with my units. Dodonna hits for 4, and then the Fighters for Freedom actually hit for another 4. And then I can actually play this aggression, defeat a Starwing Scout, ready up Sabine, and then Sabine can attack into the base for another 4 and win the game. And when I play the aggression, also deals 1 damage. So then Sabine attacks and wins. Pretty quick game. Um, this time I was able to get a lot of value in the ground arena and then just sort of push that damage through and win. My opponent actually had a quite scary space arena with the 2 Starwing Scouts, but I was able to just sort of outrace it and ignore it. Um, so ultimately, a pretty quick victory for Sabine Wren. And we're going to move into game three. So 1-1. Let's see who can win the 2 out of 3 here. We are going into game three, and let's see how this goes. So my opponent with the initiative this time, once again, Admiral Ozzel. And I bring out Sabine Wren. This time I don't have the initiative though, so we could potentially see some plays that would cause me some trouble with that Ozzel. So as an example, my opponent could lead off by giving Ozzel an experience token, which would then mean that he would trade favorably into Sabine instead of, or he would attack and defeat Sabine. Um, and Sabine would no longer be able to defeat him in one hit. We could also see a Snow Trooper Lieutenant buffing Ozzel. And that is indeed what we see, the Snow Trooper Lieutenant allowing Ozzel to defeat Sabine in one hit. So kind of, once again, it's kind of the advantage of having the initiative with stuff like that. I'm going to go for the Fighters for Freedom, though. I accidentally put my Sabine leader into my deck, and I searched for it to get her back onto the board. Bit of a gaff there. Shuffle up afterwards. My opponent uses Tarkin's ability to buff the Snow Trooper Lieutenant. And I could use Sabine's ability here, or I could take the initiative. Um, Kind of an interesting consideration. I end up taking the initiative, though. So this turn, one thing that I could do is I could play Open Fire to clear out one of those units, probably the experienced Snowtrooper. I could use Wing Leader to buff my Fighters for Freedom. I could play the Wampa. I could play another Fighters for Freedom. So having double Fighters for Freedom means that playing any red card does 2 damage to the enemy base, which is pretty good. So one thing that I could do is play the second Fighters for Freedom, and then play the Cantina Braggart for 2 damage, plus more board development. I end up deciding though that the first order of business is just going to be to attack and clear the enemy Snowtrooper Lieutenant. Attacking early is also good into Ozzel because it means that if he uses his ability to bring a unit in readied, you do get to benefit from the downside of that ability by readying a unit of your own. So if you can attack or play a new unit against Ozzel, that's maybe more beneficial, um, with the each opponent can ready a unit to um, compared to some alternatives. So my opponent brings in a readied Super Laser Technician. I have the Fighters for Freedom trade with Ozzel, which means the Super Laser Technician doesn't have an immediate target to attack. Um, he uses Tarkin's ability to buff the Super Laser Technician. And unfortunately, I don't have a space play that is really clean here. One thing that I could have done would be to wing leader the fighters for freedom before attacking Ozzel. The wing leader would mean that the super laser technician would I believe be out of range to attack and defeat it in one hit. And then if he gave it experience so that it could, I could then attack and defeat Ozzel while keeping the fighters for freedom on the board. He ends up I bring out Sabine, and he actually attacks my base instead of Sabine with the super laser technician, which is kind of a surprise. I would have assumed that he would attack Sabine, get the extra resource, and bring out Tarkin, but it may be that because he wouldn't then have another unit that he could buff with Tarkin, he may have decided that he will bring Tarkin out later. So I play Sabine and then use the wing leader to give Sabine 2 experience, attack for 5 total, and I think I can play the Cantina Braggart this turn as well, though I'm not sure if I actually do. The Cantina Braggart has the downside that the Super Laser Technician can just attack into him and defeat him immediately. It has the upside that doing that saves me 3 life on my base. I end up not doing it, but arguably I should have. I think I might have been thinking that I'll save the Cantina Braggart for a turn when I'm playing the Fighters for Freedom and therefore dealing 1 damage to the enemy base. Bit of an odd situation here. An experienced super laser technician versus a double experienced Sabine and a wing leader. My opponent leads off with a super laser technician attacking into Sabine this time, dealing 3 damage. I have Sabine just attack the enemy base, 5 damage there. The experience tokens on Sabine mean that she is swinging for 4, and then her on attack ability does an additional 1. My opponent then brings out an ETST, but I actually have a really good counter here. I'm going to, first off, I'll have the wing leader hit the enemy base for 2. The problem is that I just actually threw away my really good counter. So what I could have done is I could have used open fire on the ATST and then used Tarkin Town to clear the ATST. But the problem is now my opponent has deployed Tarkin, and as a result of that, my opponent can attack with Tarkin, give the ATST an experience, and get out of range of dying from that combination. So I've sort of just blundered with a what would have been a powerful way to deal damage to my opponent's ATST and remove it, but doesn't end up being available. Now, the interesting thing is he actually deploys Tarkin and then takes the initiative instead of attacking. But because I deployed my Fighters for Freedom, my opponent, I no longer have access to the open fire Tarkin Town combination, even though I could have used it there if I had the resources for it. And now my opponent has the opportunity for a really big, overwhelming barrage on that ETST. I believe that's likely why he took the initiative there, because he's like, okay, now I can deal 8 damage, and I will. I do have a fair amount of hit points on the field, but 8 damage would still be enough to defeat Sabine and defeat the wing leader. And, with 8 damage, he could do 4 damage to defeat Sabine, 1 damage to defeat the wing leader, and then 3 damage to defeat the Cantina Braggart. So that would clear everything except for the Fighters for Freedom, be very negative for me. Um, Not at all what I would want to see. But he ends up actually defeating Sabine and I believe he defeats Sabine and the Fighters for Freedom instead, leaving the smaller units on the board. I'm not happy with this development. I also know he has those interceptors, so my wing leader is very much a threat, but the Cantina Braggart will die almost for sure, so I have the Cantina Braggart swing first. The interceptors at least can't be brought out this turn. Cantina Braggart has 0 power on defense, so Tarkin hits the Cantina Braggart for 2, giving an experience to the ATST, and not even taking any damage. And now the ATST can attack the Cantina Braggart, defeat it, and deal a lot of damage to my base with Overwhelm as well. However, the Wing Leader bravely swings in for 2 damage. 6/7 Overwhelm, up to 7/8, and then another 2. So destroys the Cantina Braggart and pushes damage to the base. Life total's not so good now. I do bring out the Fighters for Freedom here, though. My opponent plays Piet, who I remove with open fire, also dealing 1 damage to the enemy base with the Fighters for Freedom. Down to 7 life for the opponent. This is looking not amazing though, with that ATST on the board. So I have a Fleet Lieutenant and a Surprise Strike. I resourced Dodonna, probably a mistake. I think it would be better to keep Dodonna, because I'm probably only going to be able to get value out of one of Fleet Lieutenant or Surprise Strike, because whatever unit it's very likely he'll remove at least one of my units. So it would have been better to keep the Dodonna in hand, or at least arguably better to keep the Dodonna in hand. Um, yeah, once again, the ATST destroys one of my units while also damaging my base. Not what I want to see. So probably here I Fleet Lieutenant into the base. Yeah, actually, maybe resourcing Dodonna was good. It's hard to say. It's hard to say because I wouldn't have been able to play both of these because Surprise Strike's out of aspect. I wouldn't have been able to play Surprise Strike and Dodonna, and I want to keep the Surprise Strike to potentially win the game. So I now have my opponent down to 3 life. I have a unit in both arenas. Now let's see if my opponent brings out a Emperor's Royal Guard, I take the initiative, and I'm just hoping he doesn't have an interceptor to clear my wing leader and take advantage of the space arena. If he has an interceptor, I'm probably doomed because he'll clear the space arena, and then my fleet lieutenant won't be able to get past the sentinel. But he doesn't. He plays General Veers, and so I am actually, believe it or not, in a winning position here after these troubles that I've faced. He does, however, now get to kill my fleet lieutenant with Tarkin. I originally just put 2 damage on him, but my opponent reminds me that Veers is +1/+1 for Tarkin. So that is a big, big problem for me. Ground arena completely lost. My opponent has very strong forces, has a Sentinel, has a big ATST, has his leader still on the field, but it doesn't matter because I have the surprise strike and I am going to be able to out of aspect surprise strike, and the wing leader gets in there and destroys the Imperial base before the overwhelming Imperial ground force would have been able to get the win. So ultimately, a narrow victory for Double Aggro Sabine against Aggression Tarkin. Ended up going 2-1, and those were some very interesting games. I think these have been some good ones, and I think we may actually decide here. I don't know for sure, but we may actually decide to do a game four. But I don't know. I don't know for sure if we do or don't. And interesting matchup here with the Tarkin deck being better late and the Sabina deck being better early, and some very aggressive play before. What you're really trying to do here is get aggressive play and or remove strong stuff before overwhelming barrage resets you. Um, because that overwhelming barrage is a nasty card. Probably one of the strongest cards. Probably one of the strongest cards in the game. Do we actually do a game four? I think maybe we do. All right. If I recall correctly, we do a game four, but don't have time for a game five. So game four. Once again, these Sabine games are pretty fast, so able to get maybe more games in than you would with a deck that takes longer to play. If you're playing a kind of a more control oriented deck that goes for long games and fighting for the board and bringing out some big end game unit or whatever, that might be a different scenario from the Sabine aggro. Okay, so we're gonna go in currently 2-1 for Sabine. Let's see if we can make it 3-1. We had the first game, which was a loss. We had the second game, which was a quick win. And then we had that last game, which was a much closer win. Let's see what the next one will look like. My opponent leads with Prepare for Takeoff. Search the top 8 cards of your deck for up to 2 vehicle units, reveal them, and draw them. So, searching the top 8 cards of the deck, my opponent actually gets unlucky here, maybe, and only finds one vehicle. So, tie advanced. 4 cost 3/2 when played. Give 2 experience tokens to another friendly Imperial unit. That is the only unit my opponent finds the only vehicle unit my opponent finds in the top 8 cards. I'm going to play a Rebel Pathfinder. 2 cost 2/3 with Saboteur. Very basic unit, nothing too fancy, but solid basic stats. And my hope is to buff him with the Wing Leader next turn. My opponent takes the initiative, so I have the ability to use Sabine's ability without losing timing, and I do so. My opponent accidentally flips the resourced cards there, and I see he's resourced Relentless, which seems like a prudent choice. Doesn't seem like Relentless is likely going to come into play in time in a game this fast, though of course we'll have to see. Very basic unit. The only thing on the board, the Rebel Pathfinder. My opponent brings out Ozzel. I'm going to use a Wing Leader to give 2 experience to my Pathfinder. Now a 4/5. My opponent gives an experience to Ozzel using Tarkin. I have the Pathfinder remove Ozzel. Don't want to leave that on the board. Now he can clear my Pathfinder with Tarkin Town if he wants. Ends up taking the initiative instead. I use my Sabine leader ability for 1 more damage to each base, and I'm going to be able to deploy Sabine this turn. Probably this turn I'm going to be going for Sabine plus Probably this turn I'm going to be going for Sabine plus Dodonna. I'm thinking about whether I should resource the Wampa instead of the Rebel Pathfinder. I see that I have an open fire. If I resource the Wampa, I can play open fire plus Pathfinder next turn, but I end up deciding that I'd rather resource the Pathfinder and maybe have the Wampa still there as a thing to play. Maybe I'll draw another card to play with open fire, maybe not. We'll have to see what happens. I'm often sort of thinking about like what plays are that I want to make in future turns, not just these when making resourcing choices. Imperial Interceptor clears out the Wing Leader, also getting some value there. I played Dodonna here. I think this is actually wrong. My opponent passes, so I should have attacked. I think my opponent takes the initiative. I should have actually attacked with the Pathfinder before playing Dodonna, because when I played Dodonna, my opponent should have used Tarkentown to clear the Pathfinder, but luckily for me, our mistakes maybe canceled out there, and I ended up being able to attack with the Pathfinder anyway. Um, so now I have a strong ground board, and it's looking more like the short game 2 than the closer game 3, because the quick Dodonna and other stuff in ground is pushing a lot of damage to my opponent's base, and we're going to see if we can get through and deal that last 13 damage. Plausibly, I actually could deal it this turn if my opponent again doesn't use the Tarkentown base, because I have 5 damage from the Pathfinder with Dodonna, 4 damage from Dodonna, and then another 4 from Sabine, which would actually be 13 damage for lethal. However, my opponent does remember Tarkentown this time, uses it as the first action, and clears the Pathfinder. I'm going to attack with Dodonna here, I think, for 4 damage to the enemy base. Yep, 4 damage to the enemy base. 9 life remaining for Forks. Twenty-two to 9. My opponent brings out a tie advanced, buffing the tie interceptor there. So tie interceptor now a 5/4. I'm going to bring out the wing leader that I had in hand there and buff Sabine Wren. So Sabine now up to 4/7 and actually 5/7 thanks to 5/7 thanks to Dodonna. My opponent uses Tarkin's ability for another experience token on the tie interceptor. Sabine, however, just hits the enemy base for a lot of damage. 6 total damage there. And I play the A-wing. I think my opponent actually may have just conceded here. I'm not sure. Or took the initiative earlier or something. I don't know that he actually even attacked with that interceptor, but it doesn't really matter because I have a bunch of units that can swing for lethal at this point. Overwhelming Barrage would be able to. I think actually he took the initiative. I think he took the initiative there to try and overwhelming barrage me at the start of the next turn. Because otherwise I would be able to just attack in and win with Sabine. But the problem is he can only do 8 damage with an overwhelming barrage. So he could defeat Sabine and the wing leader, but I still have Dodonna and the A-wing. He could defeat the A-wing, the wing leader, and Dodonna, but I would still have Sabine. There just isn't enough damage to actually clear out my board here, and I'm going to be able to attack in and defeat the Imperial base. Um, Now, he could have deployed Tarkin last turn and attacked into Sabine for 2 damage on Sabine and another experience token on the Interceptor. But the problem is then I would probably have been able to have the initiative and just attack and win immediately. As it stands, he indeed goes for the overwhelming barrage here, I believe, or rethinking it. No, so he ends up realizing that it's not going to help and decides to just get as much damage to my base as he can with a snow trooper lieutenant sending in the interceptor, and I blow up the base with the Green Squadron A-wing. Okay, so that was 4 games of Double Aggro Sabine versus Aggression Tarkin, and ultimately Sabine was able to prevail, going 3-1. Some interesting stuff there. Initiative continues to be really important with this type of aggressive gameplay. I mean, I think initiative is important overall, but especially so with something like this. Once again, my Double Aggro Sabine deck list is going to be in the video description, as well as a link to my introductory article if you want to learn more about the basics of this game. That's over at the Fifth Trooper blog. And so if you're interested in learning more about the basics or have maybe you have a friend who is, feel free to check that out. And yeah, so I'll have those links in the description below. Other than that, thanks for watching, guys. We'll be back later with some more Star Wars Unlimited content, and I will catch you guys later.